Thanks everyone for thanks to Fen for inviting me to be here today, and thanks to the organizers for putting this conference together. Hopefully next year we will be live again with it, but I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk today and share some patient and physician perspectives on biosimilars, which I've been working on and on issues around biosimilars since 2010. Just quickly, a little background on my background. I am the executive director of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. It is a position I have held since the organization was created. Again, we were created in 2010, which is the time that in the U.S. we, after the creation of the Affordable Care Act and BPCIA, the FDA was given the authority to establish a biosimilar pathway here in the U.S. Prior to my time at Asbm, I have served mostly in government in the U.S., including 6 years in the Office of the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I'm working on FDA and payer issues for the secretaries of HHS. Just briefly, a little bit about ASBM. We are and have been from the beginning a global network. We kind of always envisioned ourselves from the very beginning as an organization that would work on these issues. As I think today's conference demonstrates, these issues are very much global. We are primarily an organization of patient advocacy organizations, physicians, pharmacists, researchers, and some manufacturers also. And our steering committee is composed entirely of patient and physician member organizations. Just a little bit about ASBM to provide some context, I think, to the overall presentation. When we were formed back in 2010, we really formed on the basis of what we call the 4 pillars of ASBM, or our 4 guiding principles. Number 1, prioritizing patient safety. Number 2, leveraging what we have learned, and really from the beginning that meant understanding that the EU was the unquestioned leader at the time with regards to the biosimilars, both the way that they had set up a regulatory process to have biosimilars approved, but then through the years, the way that they have worked to make sure that biosimilars are adopted. And that's always something that we have kind of modeled ourselves after, is following in the EU's approach. Promoting pharmacovigilance, we've always felt it was extremely important. And if I have time at the end, I may talk a little bit about the distinguishable naming work that we have done with the WHO. But just as a founding principle, we felt it's extremely important to be able to understand adverse events, to be able to track and trace medicines, and to make sure that physicians and regulators know not only the outcome of the medicine that patients are taking, but specifically be able to track the medicines to the events if they occur. And then finally, and probably most importantly, keeping physicians relevant. And since the focus of my presentation today is really on the importance of physicians and understanding physician feedback as it relates to biosimilar policy globally, you see that that was always an important part of ASBM, keeping physicians relevant. That is, making sure that decisions being made about medicines used are made by physicians. From the beginning, we have really felt it was important and viewed our clients as regulators and policymakers more than anyone else. And so we have, going back to 2012, been very active in providing data for those regulators and policymakers. We have conducted 16 surveys, mostly physician surveys globally, as you see here in the US, Latin America, Canada, Europe, and Australia. And I'll be talking about a whole bunch of data from those surveys throughout my presentation. And then finally, just to reiterate, we have viewed our client as the regulators, and so we have done a lot of in-person work with regulators really all over the globe, whether it's the WHO, the Australian Department of Health, the TGA, Health Canada, the EU Commission, and the FDA. We have really shared and had a good relationship with those regulators in terms of providing them with information that helps them make a good patient-centric policy. Obviously, with regards to biosimilars, there is a host of issues, and I'm only really going to focus on a couple for purposes of the 30 minutes or so that I have with you today. Interchangeability and substitution is one that is really critical, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the connection between those two things, specifically since the U.S. has a interchangeable biosimilar standard at the regulatory level, which is really a super regulatory standard for biosimilars. Non-medical switching, which is becoming a big issue, I will talk about a little bit. And then if I have time at the end, distinguishable naming. But we have, suffice it to say, done a lot of work with the WHO on that issue, and unfortunately, there's not been a lot of progress. Interchangeability and substitution, again, going back to the importance of physicians, we know from the work that we have, our chairmen have always been physicians. We have worked with a variety of physician groups around the country, and what we've seen consistently is that obviously physicians have a different attitude about patients who are naive versus patients who are stable. In order for physicians to get patients to a point of stability, it is usually a long back and forth process, and they're far less comfortable switching patients who are stable than they are moving patients to biosimilars who are naive patients, that is, patients that have not yet used a biologic. Not to go too far back, but just to kind of begin around the issue of substitution. In some respects, it first showed up in 2015 when Australia became really the first nation that allowed automatic substitution. In Australia, this was done what was known as A-flagging, and basically the decision to go to automatic substitution came not from the regulator, the TGA, but it came from the Pharmacy Benefits Advisory Committee, which is the government payer. Around that time, we conducted a physician survey in Australia, and we went over to Canberra and shared that information with a number of the regulators there and the policymakers. But just to share a little bit of feedback around the questions as they were present at that time, this is a question that came from the Australian survey. How important is it for you as a prescribing physician to have the sole authority to decide together with your patient the most suitable biologic medicine? You see very important or critical was 90%. Which body do you believe should be responsible for providing the primary advice to government that a product is suitable for pharmacy level substitution? You see TGA, not surprisingly, 61%, PBAC, 33%. Again, that's the payer versus the regulator. And then Australian, really the big issue that we found over there, and this will come up throughout the my presentation today, is basically that physicians really wanted to have a more extensive level of data than they felt was available in order for them to automatically switch biosimilars. And so you see here, when you ask the question about what type of evidence do you think would be helpful in order to support automatic substitution, you see mainly around the issue of switching. And why that's important is, as we went over to talk with them, the physicians, including the Australian Rheumatology Association president, Dr. Mona Maharabani, who we met with, basically said that they really wanted to see more evidence around switching. And one of the things that we brought up with them at the time was the fact that the U.S. had this super standard, basically interchangeable biosimilars, which requires switching studies. And I'll talk about interchangeable biosimilars in a moment. But one of the things is, in general, it seemed like the physician community in Australia, when understanding the idea of interchangeable biosimilars, was much more comfortable with the idea of automatically switching. But what was also interesting is that the outcome from the automatic switch policy in Australia was really the opposite of what the government thought it would be, and that is that there was an extremely low level of switch, and that's because physicians took the additional step of basically saying, do not substitute, brand substitution not permitted. So they were allowed, in the way the law was set up in Australia, they were allowed that option, and they overwhelmingly did it. And I think the uptake rate was around 2% that first year, which was quite a shock to the Australian government. But again, when we met with the government, we talked a bit about the idea of interchangeable biosimilars. That is basically that level of evidence that allows physicians a greater degree of comfort. And as I mentioned, the uptake rate was extremely low over the course of time from once they allowed that to happen, because physicians were basically saying they did not want it to be substituted. Getting to the interchangeability standard, which we think is really important, and that is basically in the US, we have a biosimilar which can be approved, and then we have an interchangeable biosimilar. And what the law says with regards to an interchangeable biosimilar and what the FDA calls for an interchangeable biosimilar to be approved, it must be a biosimilar, it must have the same clinical result, it must create no additional risk to patients, and that is when switching studies have been product. And the result of an interchangeable biosimilar in the US, once an interchangeable biosimilar, and I'll talk about this in a moment, it according to the law, it may be substituted for the reference product without the intervention of the prescriber. And this is extremely important as you look to really around the world, the issue of non-medical switching and automatic substitution. The US has this kind of higher standard biosimilar that would allow for a automatic substitution without having to go back to the prescribing physician. The FDA put out guidance in 2017, and really it was largely supported by US physician groups who thought, basically they thought it would be a good idea to have this higher standard, and obviously felt better about the type of information that would be provided. Ultimately, as we got into automatic substitution, one of the things that we have asked physicians globally back to our surveys is how important is communication of a biosimilar substitution. So the issue, just as an example in the US, is that if it's an interchangeable biosimilar, basically you do not have to consult with the prescribing physician to make that automatic substitution. And you see here how important is communication, that is from the pharmacist to where the switch occurred to the physician or wherever the switch occurred. You see 85% in Canada, 80% US, 87% Latin America, and 77% of EU physicians consider it very important or critical to basically be alerted if a switch has occurred. How important is Dispense as written authority? Again, very high across the globe, 80% of Canada, 82 in the US, 85 in Latin America, 74. What that obviously indicates is that the physician is the one who is in control of the decision. So in the US, going back really to 2013, after the creation of the pathway and as the FDA began approving, as we were on the verge of the first approval in the US, the first approval was in March of 2015. But we at ASBM worked with others around the US to basically begin to put in place a system whereby if a biosimilar was approved as an automatic, as a interchangeable biosimilar, you would, in the states, because these decisions are made at the state level, not at the federal level, you would basically work to establish legislation that would say that you could automatically substitute the biosimilar if it was approved as an interchangeable without going back to the prescribing physician, provided that there was notification, which gets back to that issue of physicians wanting to be communicated with so they knew their patient was on something other than that they were prescribed. So in the beginning, there was a lot of resistance to this, but over time, here you see in 2014, there were very few states that had this legislation. Recently, this is on April 23rd of this year, and after 8 years of work, all 50 states in the US now can substitute interchangeable biosimilars. So the 50th state, Oklahoma, just became the final state that had this provision in place. This law was passed so it's in all 50 states. And you see here by the map. Why that's important is that we now know that interchangeable biosimilars are likely to become available in 2021. And once they are available, because of this step where we have this legislation in place in the US, the biosimilar that becomes an interchangeable biosimilar approved by the FDA automatically is substituted for the reference product. And obviously that provides a tremendous incentive. And we believe that once the first interchangeable biosimilar is approved, others will follow soon thereafter. And obviously that will go a long way towards increasing uptake in terms of market share for biosimilars. Now, I want to get into non-medical switching, which is obviously related to the idea of automatic substitution and interchangeability, though it's far more complicated in the sense that while there have yet to be approved interchangeable biosimilars, the question is, how do you get to uptake in where you do not have an interchangeable biosimilar and where you're competing? And one of the things we've obviously seen is that certainly in the US and certainly in Europe, where they've done a tremendous job, uptake and market share have followed competition. That is multiple entries into the marketplace with regards to biosimilars versus a single entry, which what tends to happen is you have a single entry into the market and that entry comes in at a low discount. And once you have competition, that discount increases dramatically. So one of the things we wanted to do is to kind of conduct a European physician survey. This survey was conducted and actually was presented right before the pandemic hit in Barcelona. And so just going over the survey and the countries surveyed, we presented the information and what we did was compared the survey. We had conducted a 2013 survey and we compared it to the 2019 survey in Europe, and again presented it at ESMO. And not surprisingly, obviously, the kind of baseline for the survey was that there was a significant increase with familiarity of biosimilars over the 6 years between the two surveys. But what was surprising and was definitely received somewhat surprisingly by the audience at ESMO was that as familiarity and comfort with biosimilars increased, so did the importance to physicians of maintaining control of treatment decisions. So here, if you see the survey, basically from 2013 to 2019, sole authority to decide treatment, you see went up 10% from 72% to 82%, despite the fact that obviously there was a significant increase in familiarity and comfort level with biosimilars. Authority to prevent substitution. Again, looking at the comparison between the 2013 survey and the 2019 survey went up again 10% from 74% in 2013 to 84% in 2019. And then when you talked with physicians again in Europe and you compared the idea of switching new versus stable patients, you see that very high degree of comfort with prescribing biosimilars to treatment-naive patients. This is obviously a really good thing with regards to their confidence. But then you see it starts to decrease when you start talking about switching a stable patient to biosimilars. And, you know, it's 40% are uncomfortable with switching a stable patient to biosimilars. So that really gets into the physician's perspective around the switching of stable versus naive patients. And then even more so when you start talking about who's making the decisions around the switch. That is, when you look at non-medical or third-party switches, you see physicians either somewhat uncomfortable or very uncomfortable when it's made by a third party. So that's different, obviously, than a switch that's led by a physician. Again, talking about how comfortable are you prescribing a biosimilar to a treatment-naive patient, you see obviously 84% very, very comfortable physicians. Obviously, lots of experience with biosimilars. Again, this is a European survey, so it reflects you know, how advanced Europe is with regards to biosimilars. But again, these kind of numbers are a little bit surprising, that you see that the importance of sole treatment decision authority has increased since 2013, and that is basically from 72 to 82%. How important it is for you, the physician, to have the authority to decide together with your patient the most suitable biologic medicine for their disease. And then importance of authority to prevent a substitution also has increased, again by 10%, the authority to prevent a substitution. And I kind of lay this out in the European survey because we're seeing this happen globally, where there is a lot of representation about kind of following in the European approach, most notably probably in Canada, but really not really following it with regards to the degree to which physicians have control over decision making in Europe. And it has still resulted in very high uptake in Europe, even though the physicians are very much involved in decision making. I just referenced this white paper that came out last fall. Basically, it was policy recommendations for a sustainable biosimilars market, lessons from Europe, and it really focuses on the principles which can be applied to develop an efficient and sustainable biosimilar market. And they really, again, focusing on the physician, it is physicians have the freedom to choose between off-patent originator biologicals and available biosimilars and to act in the best interest of their patients based on scientific evidence and clinical experience. Obviously, they also have the tender system, and there it was, and this actually was discussed in a European Commission meeting in October of 2019 as well, where they talked about the importance of multiple tenders and finally making sure that there's a level playing field between all participating manufacturers. These are the things that the Europeans at the European Commission meeting talked about as an important kind of lessons learned from the system that they had used. So one of the things that we have argued globally really is that as countries seek to replicate Europe's success, they need to understand how they got there in order to replicate it. And where we have spent a lot of energy is on the forced switching going on in Canada. British Columbia and Alberta have begun an automatic substitution, a non-medical switch program, which they said was modeled after the European approach. And in fact, we have a white paper that will come out in the next couple of weeks that talks a bit about why this is not the case. Looking at some physician survey data from Canada, you see basically the physician comfort level with third-party switching, 64% not comfortable. And we are, by the way, doing a updated survey, and we expect to see similar numbers, probably though not in the provinces where they've begun automatic substitution, simply because it's already happening there, and they tend to not weigh in the same way when the policies are being enacted. Physician concerns with third-party switching to a biosimilar. We see here, obviously, immunogenicity reactions and adverse events essentially are two of the greater concerns of physicians in Canada. And again, this goes back to what we've seen consistently globally, which is switching studies are absolutely something that physicians think are necessary in order for automatic substitution to be allowed by pharmacists or payers. Again, back to the Canadian situation, the health ministers in the provinces that have begun, which include BC and Alberta, basically talked a lot about the European biosimilar experience to justify the forced switch policy in Canada. And, as I've pointed out, and as will be made evident in our upcoming white paper, the approach is absolutely not used in any part of Europe other than probably some parts of Eastern Europe with regards to the automatic substitution with the physicians. That decision being made primarily by the government without physician involvement. Recently, it was announced that New Brunswick will also implement that policy. And basically, again, you see when they made the announcement, they said switching to biosimilars has also been conducted extensively in Europe, where countries have had over 15 years of experience with biosimilars. Biosimilars are as safe and effective as the original versions, which is definitely true, but not really the point with regards to automatic substitution. And you see this continuing theme of kind of the misunderstanding or misrepresenting the European approach to physician-led switching, which has been incredibly effective in Europe. Recently, May, Quebec announced that it is also going to implement forced switching policy. Basically, again, this despite the fact that there was an S report that came out in May of 2020 that questioned whether or not the safety of switching biologics and their interchangeability was a good idea. The study, which was done at the request of the Quebec at the time health minister, basically talked about some resistance within the physician community to automatic substitution, non-medical switching. We have done a bit of work up there, and I just referenced the No Force Switching website that we have. And then finally, as I mentioned, one of the things as we talk about physicians that has been really important and unfortunately has not moved successfully has been the idea of a global distinguishable naming program. We have been working with the WHO since 2013 in order to try and advance the biological qualifier proposal that seeks to basically tag on to the INN and establish a global standard for naming. And we actually did a fair amount of work and convened a series of meetings with the FDA, with Health Canada, and the WHO to discuss the importance of doing this, and put out a paper actually about how important it was to have a global naming. And we had all three at the time, the FDA, Health Canada, and the WHO all working together to that end. But surprisingly, in the spring of 2019, the Health Canada switched its position and basically said because of the fact that the WHO had been moving so slowly, really had made no progress, essentially because of kind of infighting around this issue of the BQ. Health Canada basically said they're going to go, their own way, and would be willing to change if the WHO led on that issue. One of the things that we have shared with the WHO, and we have been at every meeting in Geneva that was live up until the pandemic hit, going back to 2013. And we have been strong advocates for the work that Dr. Boloco and others on the expert naming group have done to move forward this BQ proposal, including sharing this information when you look at reporting when using only the INN. You see here 26% in the EU, Latin America 28, 38 in the US, 25 in Australia, and 26% in Canada. We have seen also that brand name reporting is not consistent, and that is in Europe, even though it's required. And so this is another issue with regards to the importance of how you are able to effectively track and trace a medicine if needed. And then we see from Canadian reporting in 2020, that brand name is only included 63% of the time. So in 37% of the cases, they did not specify brand name. Again, the purpose of the distinguishable naming program that the WHO and Dr. Boloco were pushing and have been really working hard to try and implement is in order to have a global standard that everybody could use. And this is probably more important in those countries with less robust regulatory bodies, even more so than Health Canada, the FDA, and the EMA in general. We have found actually that there's really strong support for distinct naming among physicians globally. If you look at these surveys, 68% in Canada, 85% in the US, 76% in Australia, 94% in Latin America. And so right now we have talked with the WHO in our most recent meeting and basically suggested that we will reach out to a number of regulators globally and try to get them to generate support for the WHO's BQ proposal. We believe the support is there, and we think it would go a long way towards giving some assurances to the physician community in terms of being able to track and trace medicines. In summary, so in the US, substitution without prescribing input can only be done with interchangeable biosimilars that have met a higher regulatory standard, that is switching studies. And even with that, communication of a substitution is still highly important. That is reflected by the physician data with regards to the need to have that communication of automatic substitution. Physicians worldwide surveyed have concerns regarding third-party switching of patients, especially for non-medical reasons, that is for cost or coverage. Patients are excited about biosimilars, but wary of forced substitution. They prefer to let physicians make treatment decisions rather than politicians and government entities. Physicians want data showing continued efficacy and safety, pharmacovigilance, including switching studies, in order to feel comfortable switching stable patients. And distinct naming of all biologics, including biosimilars, is important to physicians worldwide. We still think very strongly that international harmonization would improve global pharmacovigilance, and we think improved global pharmacovigilance would increase overall uptake of biosimilars because it would help physicians have a greater degree of confidence in their ability to track and trace a particular medicine. Again, one of the things that came up when we had our meetings with the FDA and Health Canada and the WHO was the Health Canada representative at the time said, ultimately that their job is to represent Canadians all over the world. That is, when Canadians travel, they want to make sure that if a Canadian takes medicine in another country, they have the ability to track and trace that medicine, not just what is available in Canada. So we think this is extremely important. And we think in general that obviously we're seeing, even as we came out, are now just coming out of COVID, of the pandemic, the importance of identifying medicines, the importance of basically personalized medicine has never been more clear than it is today. And with that, I will turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for the lovely session. I see a couple of questions already in there in the Q&A tab. Yeah, you have a Q&A tab on the right side of your screen there. Can you see that?
I do? Oh, okay, yeah, I do. Okay.
Yeah, actually, there are 4 questions, actually. You might want to take one by one.
Okay. Just start at the top?
Might as well, yeah.
So the first question is, and let me just make sure I can shift this down. As demonstrated by the UK regulator, MHRA, there is a policy shift to consider approval of biosimilars based on analytical similarity and PK studies without the need for repeating efficacy studies. If this comes to fruition, let me just scroll. How do I get to the bottom of that?
Just scroll down. You just need to scroll down.
Yeah, I'm trying. It's scrolling the whole thing versus.
You can see the first.
Yeah, I see the first question, but it doesn't allow me to scroll it all the way down for some reason. Hold on one second.
No, it's there's a limitation of the number of characters, basically. So what Sarah's done is.
I see. So he did it as the up above. It says, if this comes to fruition, what would have to be done to provide physicians with confidence in biosimilars if approved without the phase 3 studies? I mean, I think the answer to that question in general is that the one thing we hear consistently is obviously the need for education. With physicians. We see from the survey work that we did in the EU, if we want to just focus on the EU, that overall confidence with regards to biosimilars is extremely high, over 84, 85% confidence in biosimilars. And I think in general, there is a general feeling that the regulators have done a good job. I mean, we're not at the same place that we were back in 2012, 2013, 2014 for us here in the US, and certainly the EU has been doing this even longer. So basically, I think that, the onus is on the regulators to demonstrate why they could make have these approvals without the need for repeating these efficacy studies, and communicate to the physician community. And I think what really has been the most important thing with regards to biosimilars has been the repeated use and the comfort in knowing that these products are basically interchangeable with, and to use that concept not in the same way that it's used in the US, but to know basically that they've been very successful. Now, the one thing I would say, though, with regards to where physicians have had resistance, and we've seen this over the years in the multiple physician studies we've done, is that physicians do recognize that the presence of data and the absence of data are two different things. And that is that oftentimes the arguments made around either why we need diminished studies, or why we should be comfortable, why we, the physician community, should be comfortable with biosimilars, is that there is no adverse event data to demonstrate concerns with regards to biosimilars. So I would say that when you get into talking about potential shortcuts to data, you should recognize that physicians consider it very different to make the argument on the basis of the absence of data, meaning the absence of adverse event data that demonstrates something that you should be concerned about, versus the presence of data. And they really are focused on the latter, not the former. They do understand the difference. And so going back to our experience in Australia, and I think with the regulators and the physicians over there, the concern really there was, we don't know that we have enough data to be able to automatically switch. And what we saw was, if the physician does not have confidence, for sure, there was quite a bit of shock in the Australian situation, how low the uptake was, even with a policy in place that basically was a default to automatically substitute, and the physician had to make an additional step in order to not automatically substitute, and they made that step 98% of the time. And that tells you something about how important it is to get physicians on board with regards to comfort on data level. Want to go to the next question?
Yes, Michael. We've got from Julie a couple of questions indeed.
Okay, so in the U.S. with insulin interchangeables coming to the market, how do you expect the uptake to evolve? I think I laid that out pretty well, how I expect the uptake to evolve. And what gets interesting is, first of all, the interchangeable biosimilars in the U.S., everything is in place for that market share to go. If it's, let's just say, if it's one interchangeable coming out, that automatically is allowed in all 50 states for that interchangeable biosimilar, if it's insulin, to be substituted for the reference product. No questions asked. And the good news about that is that ultimately all of the kind of arguing in the beginning, this was not an easy process to get this in all 50 states, but the hard work was done in the beginning. 2013, 2014, 2015, there was a lot of disagreement between the physician and the pharmacy community. And it had to do with, what was perceived as burdens placed on the pharmacists with regards to notifying the physicians, what was perceived by the physicians as kind of losing control of the decision making. And ultimately, that was all worked out. And now we have in place basically a system whereby if you were approved in the U.S. as an interchangeable, you are going to basically be automatically substituted from the reference product. And we think that's a good development with regards to not only that particular interchangeable biosimilar, but also providing a tremendous incentive for other manufacturers to supply the additional data requirements that call for approval as an interchangeable. And we think that will open up the interchangeable market. And then the next question, also from Julie. What is the source of the EU data on identifiability and traceability? The latest EMA data are showing 95% identification and a general failure to report batch number mandatory. For sure, the batch number issue is one that we, first of all of the surveys are available on our website. So I should say that if someone wants to go back and look at, obviously I'm pulling data from the particular surveys, but the survey instruments, the surveys are all available on our website, which is safebiologics.org. So you can look in there. Failure to report batch number has definitely been an issue, and we see it consistently across no matter which country it has. Batch number is often used as a reason we don't need, for example, distinguishable naming, because of the fact that you have the batch number as a way of drilling down. The fact is, country after country, you'll see batch number generally in at least 40%, even in the EU, very high degree of not reporting. And our survey goes into why that is the case. Often it has to do with the fact that they don't know the batch number. They don't have it available when they're reporting an adverse event. But it doesn't really matter what the reason is. Ultimately, we think that when the argument is made that batch number should be included, and that's why we don't need distinguishable naming. We would not agree with that because as our surveys demonstrate, and again, you can go look at the surveys and drill down on those questions, but you see consistently that batch number is not reported by physicians for a variety of reasons. And then let me get to the next one from Julie. Could you clarify which stakeholders were involved in the decision-making process when setting up managed switching programs in Canadian provinces? Really, the decisions were made by the health ministers. They were not made in a consulting fashion. We were involved in all of the provinces, and ASBM is a member of the biologics working group in Canada, which is a fairly large group of Canadian patient groups. These decisions are being made by the health ministers. And frankly, it's been a bit shocking in terms of, I think what people thought in the beginning was that there was concern that Ontario, obviously the largest province in Canada, would be the province that would move everybody else to this policy. And as it turns out, Ontario is really the major obstacle in terms of the program being implemented. Ontario is still not implementing this automatic substitution, non-medical switching policy. But the decisions were made very much by the health ministers with their little, I guess, kitchen cabinets or whatever. But they were not done by, reaching out to the communities. And we think that's a big problem. And one of the things that we've said to these health ministers in general, and we've been very involved in all of these provinces, has been ultimately that if you are going to reference the EU approach, how the Europeans did it, they did not do it by just basically having the government come out and announce that they were automatically switching, because it doesn't address really the underlying point of my overall presentation, which is, as we've said to regulators globally, physicians play a very important part in terms of the adoption of biosimilars, and that is because physician confidence. Physician confidence, which is conveyed to their patients, which means that if they are confident, then their patients will be. And this confidence is derived from data. Ultimately, it is from experience and data. And as I said a bit ago, this means the presence of data. The policies at the end of the day, the way they're doing them in Canada, they're just switching automatically. And one of the things that I've said to them is, if you were at the European Commission meeting back in October in Brussels, they talked very much they've had a very consulting stakeholder process, constant meetings with stakeholders, multiple meetings, and kind of done a as you go lessons learned. And one of the very important lessons that they said in the last meeting, which was October of 2019, was it's important to make sure that you keep everybody involved. That is, in Canada, they are not allowing the innovators to compete at all for price. And the European Commission meeting, they said that is a big mistake, because ultimately the innovators in this world in which they're competing with biosimilars oftentimes can come in with a price that's lower than the biosimilar manufacturer. And from the patient perspective, the goal is basically overall to make sure that the patient gets the right medicine at the best price, not the best price for the wrong medicine. And so we've been really disappointed with regards to the kind of consulting process that Canada has taken. It's really been one province following another, and it's been the health ministers working together to develop allies in this switch without any, feedback really from the stakeholders. I see I've gone over my time, by the way, so I apologize.
That's okay. Should be okay.
I don't think there are any other questions.
Any other questions at the moment? Yeah. I'll just make sure of the same. Yeah, just a thanks message from Julie. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, and Sarah for the questions as well. I think that should be it, Michael, for the session. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. And
No, thank
thanks
you.
for the time. No, pleasure's mine always. Glad to have you on board. We'll catch up hopefully next year, face-to-face live events. Yeah.
I would love it.
To have you on board. We'll catch up hopefully next year, face-to-face live